Pull yourself together. We have work to do. And by we, I mean you.
You know what's funny is you've changed. You have. You're much more confident. Kept those eyebrows, though, didn't you?
What if the most revealing thing about The Devil Wears Prada 2 is not that Miranda Priestly is back, not that Andy Sachs is returning to Runway, and not even that the sequel has the full weight of fashion's biggest names behind it this time, but that Anne Hathaway reportedly drew a line over what kind of bodies the film would put on screen, because that is the detail that changes how I look at this sequel, and honestly, it makes the movie more interesting. For years, the easiest way to talk about The Devil Wears Prada 2 was through pure nostalgia. Miranda is back, Andy is back, Emily is back. Nigel is back, David Frankel is back, Alain Brosh McKenna is back. The fashion world is finally embracing the franchise instead of holding it at arm's length like it did in 2006. On paper, that is already enough to sell tickets. This sequel has built-in affection, built-in iconography, and built-in curiosity about what these characters look like 20 years later. But the moment you hear Meryl Streep praising Hathaway for making sure the movie would not feature skeletal models, the entire project suddenly feels like it is wrestling with something bigger than reunion. Energy. It feels like it knows the world it is returning to has changed. And maybe more importantly, it feels like it knows that some things in that world have changed in the wrong direction. That is a much stronger foundation for a sequel than simple remember how much you like this in 2006 because A Devil Wears Prada sequel that only existed to replay old rhythms would be dead on arrival for me. Yes, I want the sharp dialogue. Yes, I want Miranda's precision-guided contempt. Yes, I want Emily Blunt looking at everyone like they personally offended her simply by breathing to close. But if you are bringing this story back now in 2026, then the movie has to do more than put expensive coats on recognizable people. It has to understand what fashion culture looks like now, what media looks like now, and what power looks like now. Otherwise, it is just expensive cosplay with a perfect title card. That is why Hathaway's reported intervention matters so much. According to Meryl Streep in her new Harper's Bazaar cover conversation, both she and Hathaway were struck while filming Round Milan Fashion Week by how concerningly thin many models looked. And Hathaway went directly to the producers to get a promise that the models used in the film's own show sequences would not look so skeletal. Streep called her a stand-up girl, and the more I sit with that detail, the more it feels like one of the clearest possible signs that this sequel is at least trying to engage with modern fashion eye, instead of just admiring it from a nostalgic distance. That does not automatically make the film profound, but it does mean it has a pulse, and that matters because the original movie was always more complicated than people sometimes remember. It was not just a Cinderella story with couture, it was a film about ambition, compromise, hierarchy, taste, labor, body politics, and the emotional cost of entering a world that rewards performance while stripping away pieces of your identity. It was glossy, funny, and mean in exactly the right proportions, but underneath the entertainment was a very real argument about what success asks women to surrender in exchange for access. That story hits differently now. The media landscape is collapsing and mutating at the same time. Print no longer occupies the same cultural throne it once did. Editorial prestige has fused with influencer logic, luxury branding, social metrics, and relentless image culture. The sequel's premise reportedly places Andy Sachs back at Runway as a features editor, reuniting her with Miranda while the two of them are forced to navigate a dying print ecosystem and a newly powerful Emily. That alone is a smart pivot because it means the sequel is not pretending the old world survived untouched. It is building drama from the fact that it didn't. And that is exactly where a good sequel should start. Not from STASIS. From erosion. From adaptation. From the realization that the systems these characters mastered have changed shape beneath them. That makes Miranda Priestly interesting again, not because she returns, but because she returns into a world that may no longer reward her in the same way. It makes Andy interesting again because she is no longer the overwhelmed outsider. She is now the person embedded inside the system, old enough and experienced enough to understand what it costs. It makes Emily interesting again because power has moved sideways and upward, and she is apparently now the head of a luxury brand with the kind of leverage Runway desperately needs. Those are not just reunion mechanics, those are pressure points, and that is where I think the body image angle becomes even more important. Because you cannot make a movie about modern fashion power without touching the visual politics of the body. Not anymore, not honestly. The original Devil Wears Prada came out in a different culture, one where audiences absolutely noticed the cruelty embedded in fashion standards. But where the mainstream language around body image, representation, and the weaponization of thinness was not as openly present in media discourse as it is now, a sequel has no excuse to play dumb about that. So the fact that Hathaway apparently refused to let the fictionalized shows in the film reproduce the most alarming real-world runway bodies she saw a while. E-filming is not some side anecdote. It may be one of the clearest clues we have about what kind of moral update this film is attempting. And yes, that is a risk, because the second you make that kind of choice, the movie cannot just critique the issue casually and then still glamorize the same machinery without interrogation. If it opens that door, audiences are going to expect it to mean something. That does not mean the sequel has to turn into a lecture. It absolutely should not. This franchise works because it cuts, not because it sermonizes. But the smartest version of The Devil Wears Prada would use that awareness to sharpen its satire. It would let the glamour stay seductive while making the costs more visible than before. That is a much harder balancing act, but it is also much more exciting, and to their credit, the people behind the movie seem aware that this cannot just be a nostalgic rerun. David Frankel has described the sequel as a film about a woman in her 40s making peace with the world as it is instead of the world she wishes existed. And that is exactly the kind of line that makes me think the movie may be going for something more mature than the average legacy sequel. That framing suggests a story less about rediscovering old spark and more about confronting changed institutions, changed ambitions, and changed self-perception. That is the right lane for Anne Hathaway right now, and frankly, it is the right lane for the film. It also helps that the fashion world itself seems to have swung hard in the movie's favor this time. When the first film was made, luxury houses were reportedly hesitant to be associated with the project. Now the sequel has filmed around real Milan Fashion Week events and benefited from much stronger top-tier industry participation. That alone says something fascinating. The Devil Wears Prada is no longer the outsider looking in. It has become part of the establishment it once dramatized. That creates both opportunity and danger. Opportunity, because the film can look richer and more authentic than ever. Danger, because when institutions embrace the satire about themselves, the satire can lose bite if the filmmakers are not careful. So where do I land on all of this? I think Anne Hathaway's reported insistence on not reproducing skeletal fashion imagery may end up being one of the most important details we have heard about this sequel so far. Not because it guarantees the movie will be good, it doesn't, but because it suggests somebody at the center of the film is asking the right question. If we're going back into this world, what are we willing to endorse? What are we willing to critique? And what are we no longer willing to treat as glamorous collateral damage? That is the kind of question a sequel like this needs. Because bringing Miranda Priestly back is easy, bringing the world back honestly is much harder. And if The Devil Wears Prada really understands that, then this could end up being more than a glossy nostalgia event. It could become a sharper film about aging, ambition, fashion, image, and the uneasy evolution of power in an industry that sells beauty while often punishing the bodies inside it. That is a movie I actually want. So now, I want to know what you think. Does this Hathaway detail make The Devil Wears Prada feel more thoughtful and necessary to you? Or do you think the sequel still has to prove it is doing more than recycling? iconic characters in expensive clothes, and one more thing. If this film is really going to critique modern fashion standards while also celebrating fashion spectacle, can it actually balance those two impulses without dulling either one? That is the real challenge, and May 1st is getting closer. I'll see you in the next one.